Stand by. Is this thing on?
Yes, Dan.
Oh, hello.
You're listening to Old News with Dan and Carrie.
This just in.
Breaking news to report.
We are live.
Old newscasters
Can we just say former?
Sure. Former newscasters reunite behind the mic after more than 20 years.
Old news is good news.
Stay tuned.
Hey, you're listening and watching Old News with Dan and Carrie, and we have a great guest for you today. Steve Sabatke joins us today. And like a lot of the people that we've talked to, Steve, you started your journalism march, I guess, at the UW journalism program. So we'll talk about that. But also you spent many years in government. You spent many, many years working for the state. And you started out at a little, I don't know how many watt radio station in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin for more than a dozen years. It's Steve Sabatke, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan and Carrie. But to be completely transparent, I literally begged Dan to be on the show.
You know what? Begging works.
I mean, I said, come on, enough with the TV personalities. Let's get some radio going here.
Yes.
And I wouldn't call it begging. I would call it suggesting. You said, hey, if you ever want to hear some stories about radio, I'm your man. So
and he said, yes, we do.
And I mentioned you started, you've got your journalism degree at the University of Wisconsin. And we've talked to a lot of folks who have done that. In fact, we're going to be talking to Dr. Hoyt in a future podcast as well. And I don't know if was he part of the program when you were there?
Yeah, he was one of my professors.
Really?
Yeah. But,
yes.
I actually, when I graduated from high school, I went to UW-Madison as a pre-med student.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, how scary is that, Dr. Sabatke?
Why were you thinking about med school?
Oh, gosh. I went to Wayland Academy, which was a private school in Beaver Dam. And their last month of school, they let you do an independent study.
Uh-huh.
And I said, I want to be a movie critic. And they said, no, we're not going to let you just, watch movies every day. So they had a program whereby you could job shadow Beaver Dam doctors. I thought, okay, I'll do that because I didn't want to go to class. The alternative was going to class instead of the study. So I said, I'll do that.
Out. Yeah.
So then, once I went through that, everybody in the family said, oh, Steve wants to be a doctor. So I said, okay, I'll try it. Well, it was UW-Madison. It was 1976. You can put it all together there. The pre-med lasted about maybe 2 years. And I ended up switching to journalism.
So had you thought about journalism before that when you were younger, or is that something you kind of grew to like while you were in college?
Well, when I was a kid, my uncle, his name was Don Sabatke. He was my dad's brother. He managed a radio station in Waupun, which is near Beaver Dam.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad took me there one day to take a tour of the station. And I was just absolutely fascinated by it because as a kid, I grew up listening to Top 40 AM radio, WOKY in Milwaukee, WLS in Chicago, John Rutgers Landecker, Bob Surratt, Larry Lujak. And I wanted to be those guys. And I finally got to see this radio station in action. I thought, gosh, how great is this? You get to get put in this small room. You're surrounded by equipment. You can play records. You can talk. What a great way to inform and entertain people with nobody looking at you. Nobody, nobody's.
And maybe you could be that movie critic after all. That movie critic could creep in the radio.
Yeah, so I think my interest in radio started at that time.
And then when did you get the journalism bug? I mean, was that kind of an ends to a means to an end?
I think that was always in the back of my mind because I didn't know how long pre-med was going to last, to be completely honest with you. So I switched to journalism. My parents were not happy with that decision, to say the least.
Yeah.
But
I understand that.
Yeah, and I ended up doing the 5-year college program, not 4 years. And in my 5th year of college, I would come home every weekend to work the Saturday and Sunday night shifts at WBEV
Wow.
in Beaver, the hometown radio station. And basically, you were just running the board because there may be sports on or some other taped programs that you would run. But every once in a while, you got to play a few records and announce.
Yeah.
So while the other students were out partying, you went home and worked
Yeah,
all night.
I came home every weekend to do that 2-night shift.
That takes a
Wow.
lot of discipline.
Yeah, I'd get home Sunday night at about 1 o'clock after doing all my sign-off duties, and then getting up the early, a few hours later to grab my ride back to campus in
So
Madison.
then you graduated and they said, "Hey, do you want a job?"
No,
No.
They
Didn't work that
have
way, huh?
They didn't have anything open, so I had to earn some money. So the Green Giant canning plant was located right across the street from the radio station.
Oh.
Perfect.
I signed up for a job there for the canning season, and I don't know why they made me a forklift driver. I was the world's worst forklift driver. I dumped so many pallets of cans of vegetables, of green beans. But I did that for a few months until they finally called me in, asked me if I was interested in a job. I ended up doing, being the night shift announcer, coming in at
And what
5
was
o'clock.
the night shift? Like what times were those?
I think it was like you come in at
You remember?
4 o'clock, 4 or 5, and then you're on the air till midnight. We signed off at midnight, and then you would have a number of things that you would have to do afterwards. That would take about an hour or so.
And were you were playing music and then talking in between,
Yeah,
or
I mean,
what were you doing on air?
it was mainly playing some music. I mean, WBEV was very, very conservative when it came to music. It was a very light contemporary genre that they had. They wouldn't play songs like Revolution by the Beatles because they thought it was too rock and roll, that kind of thing. So there were certain
So
songs you could play.
it was more Barry Manilow and
Yeah,
that kind of stuff.
Frank
Okay.
Sinatra and Nat King Cole, which I love
Hey, I'm
today.
good with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm good with that today. But back then I was like, But it was Brewer
Yeah.
games, Bucks games, sports at night where you would run the board, play the commercials, that kind of thing.
Were you ripping and reading too, or were you writing news updates at that point?
No, I mean, my goal was to get into the newsroom because of my, degree my college degree. And about a year after I started working there full time, they did put me into the news department and became a news announcer / reporter.
So explain that to people who might not know how radio used to
Sure.
be in some ways, because now we'll hear some news updates once in a while on the hour, but back in those days they had a news department.
Well, I mean, I think we were unusual for a small market radio station. I mean, Beaver Dam was about 15,000 people. We had a 2-person news department, which there was a lot of small town radio stations that only had a 1-person news department.
Right.
And BEV, the emphasis, the mantra was local news, local news, local news. I mean, we hammered that. I mean, we worked hard to try to fill every newscast morning and afternoon with local news stories that we went out and got either, in person or by the phone. We would try to get them with audio, either, recording interviews with the person over the phone or taking a tape recorder out to the scene. And, it was just, I mean, for a number of years, I was always of that. My mind was always working. How can I would see something or I would talk to somebody and there would be something that would click in my brain that would say, this could make a local news story, or something connected to this could make a local news story. I mean, Beaver Dam's not like Madison. It's not like Milwaukee where there's things happening every day. So we were out trying to find as much local news as we possibly could, and not only during the heavy listenership times where, you know, it's Monday through Friday, but on the weekends as well, and holidays, we had to fill up those newscasts with as many local stories with tape, with audio that we could.
What were some of the most memorable stories from that time? Do you remember some of them still?
Sure. You know, I had an opportunity to interview the actor Fred MacMurray.
Oh, yeah.
Dad probably knows who Fred MacMurray is.
Yeah, it's My Three Sons. Yeah, he was
Yeah,
the dad
My
in
Three
My Three
Sons.
Sons.
My Three Sons.
Yeah, he played Stephen Douglas, the father. He did the Disney.
Wasn't he in Flubber too?
The son of Flubber, absent-minded
Son of Flubber.
professor.
Okay.
He played some bad guys in movies like The Apartment, which I just saw recently, and Double Indemnity. It was Beaver Dam sesquicentennial that was coming up, and Fred MacMurray, he wasn't born in Beaver Dam. His mother was from Beaver Dam. But he did grow up in Beaver Dam, and he went to high school at the Beaver Dam High School, and he played in the Beaver Dam High School band with my grandfather, Ray Sabatke. And my grandfather had a picture of the high school band during that time with he and Fred MacMurray in the picture. So I found somebody in Beaver Dam that actually had Fred's phone number, and this was late 80s, I think, and I talked him into giving it to me. That took some doing. He didn't want to, you know, disrupt Fred's privacy.
Right. But you're a good journalist, so you got it.
Yeah, I mean, Fred was retired. He wasn't doing it, you know, acting anymore. But I got his number. I called the number. His wife, June Haver, who was also an actress, answered the phone, very nice, and said, "Fred's taking a shower. He'll call you right back." You know, okay. And I'm thinking, you know, as I'm waiting, he's not going to call me back.
Yeah.
Well, sure enough, about a half an hour later, the phone rang, and it was Fred MacMurray. And I mean, there was that brief moment where you're just like going, "Oh my God,
it's happening."
It's Chip's dad. Yeah.
So it wasn't a long interview, but we talked about, you know, being on the show and the movies, and he you know, he loved being in the Disney movies.
Yeah.
And I think his favorite movie was Double Indemnity.
I killed Dietrichson. Me, Walter Neff, insurance agent, 35 years old, unmarried, no visible scars. Until a while ago, that is.
Which he starred in with Barbara Stanwyck.
He was a bad guy in that one, wasn't he?
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he kind
of
broke into a murder by Barbara Stanwyck.
Yeah,
and, talked about his time in Beaver Dam, and I did ask him if he remembered my grandfather. Now he said that he did.
How could I have known that murder?
Whether that was the case or not, I don't know, but I got a real big thrill out of that. And of course, I told my grandfather afterwards about it. So that was you know, really exciting.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's one of those featurey kind of story. I mean, that's a great featurey kind of story. How about on the other end of the spectrum? You know, hot news or bad news or
yeah, you and I were talking before we started taping that one of the downsides of being a news reporter at your hometown radio station in a small market is that tragic events do happen. And there are times when those tragic events involve people or victims that you know personally or that you have a connection to.
Especially in a town of 15,000 people.
Yeah. And I mean, you got to do your job. You have to report on them. But I remember one such case. It was in 1986. Dan, you may remember this. There was a young man by the name of Kurt Daler. And he stabbed his mother to death, and then he ran across the street to the home across the street, and he stabbed to death an elderly woman. This occurred in the neighborhood where I grew up as a kid. In fact, my parents were still living in the house a short distance from where this happened. It was a horseshoe block, and my parents lived on the other side of the horseshoe. My brother and I, when we were kids, played with Kurt Daler and his brother a few times. We weren't really friends with them, but we did play with them a few times.
Right. You're on the block. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The elderly woman that he killed, when her husband was alive and I was a kid, they had this huge garden in the backyard, and their backyard was a few lots from our backyard. So as a kid, I would run over. When I saw them working the garden, I would run over there and help them with the garden work.
Mm.
And they were like second grandparents to me.
Mm.
And the woman's son was my dad's best friend. And in fact, he was partners with him on an athletic shoe store that they started downtown. So
Wow.
all these local connections that, when this happened, you just, all this stuff just starts going through your mind about, wow, I mean, I played with this guy as a kid. I knew this woman who was, brutally murdered. And it was a really tough thing to report on.
How did you manage
navigate?
that? Yeah.
We were both saying the same thing. Yeah, like when the victims and the alleged murderers, how do you gather the news in a way that still kind of, I don't know if protects you is a good word, but just that keeps you sane? It's your hometown.
Yeah, I mean, you just got to do the best you can and just kind of put all, I mean, that's all floating around in your mind, and you have to do the best you can and keep that off to the back while you report on what happened. Because BEV was the kind of station where, I mean, our competition really wasn't other radio stations in Dodge County. There was the one in Waupun, one in Watertown. It was the local newspaper, the Beaver Dam Daily Citizen, which was a daily paper. So that was our competition. So, I mean, people in the Beaver Dam area, Dodge County area, I mean, we were always number one in Dodge County. They would tune us in to find out what was happening. If they heard sirens going off the night before, like a fire truck, they would turn on us in the early, the morning newscast the next day to find out what was going on. So you had to, that's what you had to do. You had to present that because you knew there were people that were turning you on to say, geez, I heard there was something going, and you know how small towns are.
Right.
Yeah.
It's probably the case that there's probably people out there listening that may know more about what's going on than what you know because of, what you can report officially.
Right.
That's just the way it is in a small town.
Were you breaking in live sometimes then too with a story like that? Would you break in live into the programming of the day?
Yeah, I mean, there was another case where we had this old factory located in the center of town. It was called Monarch Range, and they used to make stoves and ovens. Sometimes you would see those prizes being given away on Truth or Consequences, or the old Price is Right. And it was an abandoned old manufacturing industrial property, and 3 young kids got in there one night and they found some silk banners for Monarch Range, and they decided to light one on fire, and it got out of control. And you had this huge fire now in the middle of town. And yeah, we did set up equipment so we would be broadcasting live, because I mean, it was a big thing that was happening to the community at the time.
So that was funny in the 80s. Would that have been early 80s?
In the 80s, early 90s. Yeah.
What was your live capability? Did you have a huge truck? Did you have to send up the giant mast, or how did you do it?
It was it was in Beaver Dam. It was an antenna that was hooked up to a box that was called a Marty unit. That's just what it was called. And then we would have the ability, by setting that up, to send our broadcasts back to the radio station so that they would go out over the air. I mean, I don't know how that worked technically, but that's pretty much what we used. We used that when we would broadcast at the Dodge County Fair every year. I mean, every year I had to broadcast the 4-H meat animal auction. How exciting is that?
I'm sure some people did think it was riveting.
Well, yeah, it was.
Yeah,
I mean, we
right.
had sponsors for it. It was a big deal. I mean, people wanted to who weren't able to be there. There might be some grandparents out there that wanted to see how, their grandchild's
For sure.
steer did, and who it was sold to.
Absolutely.
Well, and Carrie, I was saying to Steve before we came on here too, I always envied the radio guys and the newspaper guys when you were out covering live news because, we'd have to sit there and wait for the live truck to get the mast up and then get all the wires hooked up and everything. And the radio guys would either, they'd have the Marty unit or they'd go to a phone nearby and they'd be calling
Yeah.
it and then they'd have the live report right there. And, we're waiting for, come on, let's get set up. Let's go. It really was, I mean, radio, I think of this when I'm on social media, radio was really the original social media because I mean, it was so immediate. You think of the days of Edward R. Murrow way back during World War II and broadcasting from the rooftops of London and things like that. That's kind of what people do now with social media, right? It's just even that much more immediate. So I always thought radio was such a cool medium, and I still do. I still listen to the radio, in the car, and my kids are like, "Why don't you just, why don't you just listen on your phone, Dad?" But I still, I'm one of those guys who still listens to the radio.
I do too.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
just,
when the tornado sirens went off in Dodge County, we
yeah,
had to stop whatever we were doing at the time, and we had to go to the radio station and start broadcasting live about, the tornado warning. And it was nonstop until that warning expired. So you would be reading things off the National Weather Service wire. You big roll of paper on a printing machine, old teletype. We would have our meteorologist on, I think it was from Madison, that would call in, and we'd have them on to talk about what was going on. We would have on the Dodge County Sheriff's Department emergency officer who was responsible for monitoring those situations.
yeah.
If there was something, if a tornado went through a local community and there was some damage, people would call in and we'd put them on live on the air to talk about what they saw. It was constant coverage until everything calmed down.
And who can forget those days when you were a kid? Like when I was a kid, you'd turn the radio on in the morning when there was a snowstorm the night before
Yep.
because you'd be reading off every school that was closed.
I got to tell you, Dan, the busiest times for me, because I would work Sunday morning shifts, and sometimes I would have to run the board and do the news at the same time, is if there was a snowstorm and all the local churches in Dodge County would call us to let us know the service was canceled. I mean, the phone was ringing nonstop, and you're frantically writing stuff down because I don't have a computer in front of me where I can type this in, and you got all these little pieces of paper where St. John's in Marquezan or somebody in Lamira, is closed, and you had to get it on not only the AM station, but you also had to get it on the FM station as well. So, and
Pardon the pun, but thank God for the internet now, huh?
yeah,
Now they
yeah. It was crazy. It really was.
Yeah.
So you were going out, you're gathering news. But I imagine you might have had a little recorder at times when you were doing on location interviews and things. Would you come back and would you cart that, put it on a cart, or would you do reel to reel, or what was the technology at that point?
We had cassette decks that we would use with microphones if we went to a meeting and we wanted to interview somebody after a meeting. I mean, speaking of that, we just didn't cover Beaver Dam City Council and Beaver Dam School Board. We tried to cover as many city council and school board meetings that we possibly could in Dodge
With
County.
two people.
With two people. So, I mean, there was easily weeks where I was gone, 2 to 3 nights a week because we were out covering Mayville and Juneau and Horicon and Fox Lake and Columbus and Waupun.
Wow.
We covered the Dodge County board. But yeah, we would use cassette decks, old Marantz cassette decks, and then we would have, reel to reels, where we would have a reel to reel machine in our newsrooms. We had 2 newsrooms, which would be hooked up to the phone. If we did an interview over the phone, we would tape it, and then we would take, bits and pieces from those interviews and put them on the carts, what looked
Mhm.
like the old 8-track
Yeah.
carts.
So
Yeah.
you were
And play
doing the
those.
editing, you were editing yourself, all of
Yep.
your stories.
Oh yeah. Typing on an electric typewriter. No
And we thought
computer.
we had it bad in the morning show, Carrie, right?
Yeah, really. At least we had a computer.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and even that, I mean, they were ripping stuff off the wires for national stories, right?
Yeah, I mean, not to put down any other station, but back then there were a number of small stations that, were pretty much rip and read stations. They would have either AP or UPI. We had UPI, which was the lesser of the two. And they would, rip the state news and the national news and the sports stuff off those machines and read them on the air. We did use that, but we used it as a supplement.
Right.
Our newscast would always start out with local stories, and then we would have some state news from the wire in there, and then sports after that. So we tried to get away from that rip and read concept.
How
Right.
many
And
years
you were
did you
covering
do that?
sports too. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, high school football nights, Friday nights, we would have people that would call in on Friday nights and give us scores of games that were going on, because we tried to get the scores of all the local high school football teams in the area.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we would get them off the UPI wire, sometimes we would get them from phone calls.
I'm having a flashback of Andy Kendi. We interviewed him on the podcast, and he said even the early days where he was working in TV in Madison, they'd be like, "How are we going to get that score? Let's call the McDonald's because there's got to be high school kids there after the game." And then they'd be like, "Hey kids, anybody have the score?"
Yeah, I mean, we
So they
had a
could get that
sports
last minute stuff.
we had a sports director, Norm Gray. He would have all the schedules, and he would write up a sheet with all the games that were being played that night, and we would just have, we'd fill those scores in once we got them, and hopefully we had them all the next morning. Because sure enough, if you missed a score, you would get a call from somebody saying, "How come you're not saying what happened to the Houstonford football game, or Mayville, or something like that?"
Mhm.
But I
I'm
mean, we were
picturing.
doing sports. We were reading, not to get down, but we were reading during our new newscasts obituaries.
Mm.
That was a part of the new newscast where you had to
Wow.
They
read
still do that up
obituaries.
north.
Do they?
I think they still do it at Beaver Dam too.
Do they? Do they? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's back then. I mean, and still today, I would imagine it was a source of revenue because the funeral homes paid for that.
Sure.
And so they would send in obituaries over the fax machine, and you would have to read them on the air, and you would have to make darn sure that you pronounced every name correctly, because if you didn't, you would certainly hear about it, since that
Wow.
was something that they were paying for. So that was part
And
of
in
it.
Wisconsin, that's not easy. Getting all
No,
those
it's
names
not.
No.
right.
There's
Yeah,
certain
there
names
that's a
of
source of
families in Beaver
stress.
Dam that are pronounced a certain way.
Like Sabatke.
Yeah, I mean, I remember my first time on the air where I had to read some news, and I was just an announcer at the time, and I'm not a fisherman. I don't fish.
Mm.
Instead of saying crappies, I said crappies. And yeah, that generated a few phone calls.
Right.
Good indoctrination. So how long were you at that radio station, Stephen? Was that your only radio experience then?
Yeah, that was it. I mean, other than working, doing the radio on Sunbury Media Center, but I started out part-time in 1980, became full-time in 81, and then I ran for mayor of Beaver Dam, which at the time was a full-time job,
Yeah.
and was elected in 94. So I was on the radio from 80 to 94. I really
Wow.
never had an inkling to go to a larger market. I just didn't feel I was ready for it, despite my experience. Excuse me. Wasn't really ready to do radio news in a big city.
Yeah.
And then, there was one thing that kind of turned me off of a larger market, you know, radio station or TV station. I don't know if you remember this, Dan, but I don't know if it was the late 80s, early 90s. There was a train derailment in the village of Fall River, which is a
I remember that.
small
Yep.
community next to Columbus. Amtrak train, part of the train went off the tracks into a ditch. One or two people were killed, others were injured. So this was a big story. And when big stories happen like this in Dodge County, you get news reporters from Madison, Milwaukee, Green Bay, the three big markets,
Yeah.
came to Fall River. All the reporters were gathered in one area. And I remember there was a reporter from one of the Milwaukee stations. I still remember his name. I'm not going to give it, but he worked for a Milwaukee TV station, and he asked the representative of the authorities at the time that he wanted to go into one of the cars that was still on the track and interview the passengers that were in there. And the sheriff's department spokesman or whoever said, no, we're not going to allow that at this time. We're still doing investigating. And this guy just made such a thing. I mean, he was loud, he was obnoxious, he whined about it. He would bring up stuff. I have a right, I'm the press, I have a right to go in there. You can't stop me. I mean, I get it, I mean, it's competitive. You got to do whatever you can to get a story. I completely understand that, but I thought,
Right.
his behavior at that moment was pretty embarrassing. And I just thought to myself, do I want to do that by going to a larger market? And that turned me off to that. So.
Yeah, it's pretty cutthroat in some of those large markets, I'm sure. Well, it may have been. I don't know what it's like now, but yeah, back in the day.
Yeah.
So did it help you? I mean, you said you became the mayor of Beaver Dam. Did it help you that you had been on the radio all those years? Do you think just the name recognition?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have any political experience. I had zero experience. People knew me because of me being on the radio. When I go back to Beaver Dam now, and let's say if I'm in a grocery store and people
Yeah.
recognize me, they don't recognize me because of being mayor for a couple of years. They recognize me from being on the radio.
Right.
Uh,
They
so yeah,
recognize your voice when you say,
yeah,
where are the
they'll say,
beans? And they're like, oh, that's Steve.
well, you look familiar. What's your name? And I would tell them my name, and they go, oh yeah, the guy that was on the radio.
Now, what prompted you to go into politics and be mayor?
The current mayor decided that he was not going to seek re-election. He was going to retire, and there was a few people that said, why don't you go ahead and do it? And I took that step, and I got elected. Unfortunately, I lost 2 years later, but and it was at that right before that time where I was getting kind of burned out by radio, being on the radio. I mean, I was working 50, 60 hours a week. I had a family. The pay, I
That
mean,
was my question. Yeah.
Yeah.
you guys know this. The pay was not great at all.
That's an overstatement. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I for a few years, me and another guy who worked at the radio station were supplementing our income. We were partners in a portable DJ business where we would play weddings, that kind of thing. But
Yep.
after a few years of that started to get old because, I would be working 50, 60 hours a week at WBEV, and then come Saturday night, I'd have to load up my car with all the equipment and everything and go to play a wedding, and put on a happy face. So the opportunity came up. I tried to find a job outside of radio. I wasn't successful. This came up. I took a shot and I got in.
And you got elected.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, I mean, when did you started in radio in whatever 1980? Were you married already, or no, you had just gotten out of school, right?
Yep.
You got married in those 14 years, and then you started having kids, and then life just had to be crazy for you. They probably never saw you.
Well, there were times when I would do my shift, and then I would still have stories to write. Even though your shift was over, you would have local stories you would have to write up for the newscasts. So I'd go pick up my daughter, who was a baby at the time, from the local daycare. I would bring her back to the radio station. I would set up a place in one of the newsrooms, in the second newsroom, and set up some blankets and stuff and put her down. Blankets. Well, I'm typing away, writing up my news stories.
So they literally grew up in the newsroom. Did anybody
Yeah.
go into news? Any of your
No,
children?
she didn't. I told her don't do that.
Yeah.
Said I heard
Yeah.
enough of that clickety clack happening.
She's in marketing, but so close, I
It's
guess.
adjacent, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
yeah, it is.
So you were elected mayor and you did that for what, 2 years, you said?
Yep.
2 years, and then you didn't get reelected, but you were a county supervisor, weren't you, in Dodge
Yeah, I
County?
was on the Dodge County Board of Supervisors after that, several years after that, for about 5 years. Ended up having to resign because we moved out of Beaver Dam to Madison.
Okay.
But yeah, served on the county board. I tried to. I was a candidate for Beaver Dam City Council a couple of times. Unfortunately, didn't get in. I was a candidate for Beaver Dam School Board, didn't get in there. Did get into the county board. So that
Yeah.
was interesting.
So after covering all of those bodies, you had a real interest in participating. What was it about being in local politics that made you so interested?
It's just one of those. My life has been a series of circumstances where things just came up and I took a shot and I got in. There was this opening for mayor because the incumbent decided not to run. And so I put my hat into the ring and I fortunately got elected. And as I said before, it was a full-time job. After I lost as mayor, I was unemployed for about a month or two, didn't quite know what to do. There was the radio station in Ripon that called me and asked me if I was interested in working there, but I really wasn't. I really didn't want to go back into radio.
That was
And
behind you. Yeah.
No disrespect to Ripon, but my family did not want to move to Ripon. Um, a guy that I used to interview when he was the economic development director in Waupun, he was a bureau director with the Wisconsin Department of Commerce. He had a opening in a limited term position, asked me if I was interested, gave me a call one day and asked me if I was interested. And I said, yeah, I'm not doing anything. So,
Yeah.
again,
Let me see. Yes.
zero.
Yeah.
The only economic development experience I had was when I was mayor,
Uh-huh.
which wasn't much, but there was some there. And I ended up starting in 1996, working a limited term for the state, and then became permanent full-time in 1998.
Wow.
And so you parlayed that into some 30 years of economic development experience and management.
Yeah. Department of Commerce morphed into Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation in 2011. Stayed
Yeah.
with it. I've been there ever since. And now I'm thinking about, maybe it's time retiring.
You're getting to that point in your life. And I noticed on your resume too, you had something about, you were the industrial revenue bond specialist. Like,
Still
what
am.
does that mean? What is that?
Oh, I could bore you to tears for about
Don't
an
bore us
hour
to death.
more
Yeah.
about that.
Give us the spicy version.
Yeah.
Industrial revenue bonds, it's a form of lower cost financing for small manufacturers, not, the big guys like John Deere or any of those big manufacturers, but the smaller manufacturers can access this program and get financing for their expansion projects with a lower interest rate. I've been doing that since 1998.
Wow.
It's called job security.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
you're the guy.
Yeah,
You want to know that.
I'm the
your
IRB
skills-
guy for the state of Wisconsin.
Did your skills in radio translate well to what you have been doing for the past decades?
Yeah, I think it has, because right now I'm doing underwriting. I'm part of a team that underwrites financial assistance applications that come in from different companies, municipalities for grants, tax credits, loans. So you get these applications, and I think, my experience as a reporter, where you're asking questions, who, what, why, when, how, all those different things that you're trying to get at as you're putting together a story. that helps me now when I'm underwriting these financial assistance applications. Why are you doing this project? What exactly are you going to be doing? How many jobs are you going to create? That kind of thing, as we're trying to
Yeah.
get to the heart so that we can do write-ups that are eventually approved by our supervisors. So it does help. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and Carrie, you should know, I mean, Steve returned to the media then at Sun Prairie Media Center because he, like me, it was a fun outlet. I don't know if you were doing it. You were doing it before the pandemic, Steve, but
Yes. Mm-hmm.
he's been doing radio over there, Council Rewind, and he does a show, one of my favorite shows on the Sun Prairie Media Center.
7-8.
Um,
Yeah, you're my only listener, Dan.
I love it. It's called Seldom Heard, and he plays songs that are seldom heard on the radio,
That's
and
fun.
he kind of covers a pretty broad range. I love that show, so I'm gonna miss it when you're gone for a little while there, Steve.
Yeah, yeah. 50s, 60s, some 70s.
Yeah.
Come down to my
So
basement and you see the milk jug crates. They're just everywhere of CDs.
so not vinyl, CDs
No,
or
no
both.
vinyl. I used
No
to have a
vinyl.
bunch of vinyl I got out of it because I thought vinyl was dead when CDs, became a
Yep.
thing. So I
Yep.
got rid of all my records. Now it's
The
a thing.
The Sun Prairie Media Center is an amazing facility. I can see why you gravitated there. So did you just had an urge to dust off your old skills and get back in there and in when you had a little more time?
Yeah, I mean, we were living in Sun Prairie. In 2015, my wife and I went to one of the local restaurants. They had a poster up that said, "Hey, if you want to get involved in this community radio station, we meet such and such times on these dates, and here's a phone number you can call." And my wife said, "You should do this. You do this to get back into radio." And I just kind of went, "No." I just, brushed it off, came up with a million different reasons not to do it. Then in 2016, I had a couple of health scares where I ended up in the hospital each time a week. Got back to work after those, and again, it was just one of those moments where you think to yourself, "I'm going to do this." So I picked up the phone, called the media center, got the person who was in charge of the radio station, and ended up doing the show that Dan talked about, and then it kind of really grew from
Morphed.
there. uh, and then I got, I ended up doing baseball and football, which I had never done before.
Really?
Yeah, never done play-by-play. I did some TV. Dan was one of the co-hosts from time to time on the movie review show, Real Reviews.
Yeah.
I would do that at least once
Yeah.
a month.
So he finally did get to do his
I
movie
was gonna
reviews.
say
And
full
I finally
circle
got to do
moment.
it. It was great. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's
No,
wonderful.
and it's great because I think a lot of people don't realize how, I mean, Sun Prairie has a media center. There's a lot of local communities around here that have media centers. You probably have them by you too. And a lot of people have that in mind that, the old Michael Myers, Wayne's World, the broadcasting from Aurora, whatever, cable media. And it it's a place where a lot of creativity takes place. And people are able to kind of go and play and do radio, do TV, social media in many cases now. So it's kind of a nice playground for people, especially people like Steve and I, who had some experience at it and still wanted to have some fun with it.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
it's amazing. Go
back when I
ahead.
was mayor, I mean, the local cable access channel in Beaver Dam, the only thing it really showed was the Beaver Dam City Council meetings.
Right,
That was it.
right.
Other
Yeah. And
times,
some still do that.
yeah, and I don't know if they've grown from that or not. I just don't know. But I mean, when it was not on the air, it would just have the crawls and the community events that would show up. So you would be on TV, and that's how people. You got a pretty sizable audience watching the council meetings at night. I mean, I remember coming home one night where my wife said to me, she just kind of shook her head and says, you got to cut that out. I said, what? He says, when somebody says something dumb, you roll your eyes, and you can see it right there on television.
They're
You're like, that
watching.
never happened in radio. I didn't have to
No.
think about that.
You could sit there and go, oh, on radio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah,
No,
you had
that's
to.
well,
That's funny.
Steve, we've taken up a lot of your time, but I always ask people, I think you said, was your first job the forklift job, or did you have a job before that when you were in high school or something like that?
When I was in high school.
Yeah, did you have a job before that forklift job that you took?
My first job as a young kid was I was stocking shelves at the liquor store, which was not too far from where we lived.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So you did know everybody in town. You're right.
yeah. Well, yeah, Beaver Dam had a lot of liquor stores.
And what was your, if you don't mind saying, what was your worst job that you ever had, Steve?
The worst job, and not because of the conditions, but because I wasn't ready for it and I just wasn't very good at it. I was a member of the athletic training department for the Badger football team.
Wow.
Huh.
Yeah, and the only reason I got the job was because the summer before my freshman year started at UW-Madison, my father's one of his good friends ran a athletic training camp at Wayland Academy, and my father decided to sign me up. Didn't ask me, he just says, you're going to do this.
Thanks, Dad.
So I did it. I was awful at it. I couldn't tape an ankle. I was awful at that. Uh, the I got I got a job as an athletic trainer as a freshman with the football team.
That's impressive.
Yeah, I don't know why they hired me, but and it was fun to be in that environment. Although back then, Badger football was not a big deal. I mean, it was
Yeah.
it was a losing program in the mid '70s.
Yeah.
But it was fun being on the sideline for some of the home games.
Yeah.
But I was horrible at it. And I was let go after the football season.
You tried.
They just
You
they
learned.
looked at me and said, "This isn't for you." And I went, "I agree. It's
You're like,
not."
in fact, I'm going to change my major from pre-med to journalism. Let's just do it all at once.
Yeah, it was awful.
And then I mean, I know we've talked about it. You're kind of closing in on retirement now. But
Mhm.
is there something you're still thirsting to do?
Oh boy, Dan, I really don't know. I mean, I've always wanted to do sports, and I've done a couple of years of baseball. Done a couple of years of football. Maybe basketball. I don't know.
There you
We'll
go.
see. Yeah,
Good.
I
We're
always
going to hold you
wanted
to that.
to do some TV. I've done a little TV now through the Sun Prairie Media Center. You're much better looking on TV than I am, though, Dan.
Ah, well, gee, thank you. I don't agree, but that's okay.
How about something in the blooper realm? Do you have any bloopers from your radio days that still make you chuckle or cringe?
Sure, I can tell you one. Every once in a while, the news announcers had to run the board because the announcers had to go to a meeting or something. So one day there was an announcer meeting, and I had to run the board. And there was a game coming up where people would call in. I can't remember what the game was, so I ran that, and I never ran that game before, so I didn't really run it real well. But after it was over, I tried to find the next commercial to play because you had carts that you had to play. There wasn't a computer. I thought my mic was off, so I said a few choice words, and my mic was not off.
Oop.
It
Oh
went out over
boy.
the air. About 10 seconds later, the station manager is running into the control room, and he's desperately trying to find the microphone switch. And I'm like, what's going on? What's going on? I
You're
didn't
like,
know.
what the bleep is happening?
Yeah. So I thought I was going to get fired after the day. After that, I was not fired, but a lot of people heard it. A lot of people told me about it. My grandmother heard it.
Oh
Oh
boy.
Yeah.
no. That was your punishment. Grandma heard it.
Right. That's the worst. Oh no.
Yeah, that was not one of my brightest
A
moments
lower moment.
on the radio.
I gotcha.
Well, Steve, thanks so much for talking with us here on Old News today. It's been great to hear about your career, and I'm sure people who live in the Beaver Dam area and the Madison area who remember you are going to like hearing some of those stories. And I don't know, do you remember, before we leave, do you remember how you would sign off when you're doing the radio days?
Oh no, I don't.
You don't remember, huh?
It wasn't a standard sign off. I wasn't
Okay.
that cool,
Yeah, that's okay.
you know.
You can
Some
have one
people
when
have
you
that.
start doing sports in your retirement.
Right, yeah.
We'll plant that seed.
No,
Well, thanks, Steve.
nothing
It's been
special.
great having you.
Yeah.
And
Hey,
we'll
thank
catch
you.
up with
Great
you
to
too.
meet
And
you.
Really appreciate it.
And
It's
good
been
luck
fun.
to you. This has been Old News with Dan and Carrie. If you like what you hear today or anytime you're listening to Old News, make sure you click subscribe because we'd love to have you along for the ride. See you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Old News with Dan and Carrie.
That's Old News for now.
Join us next time.